A black waitress heard a scream and stepped into a crumbling basement, looking for a victim. What she didn't know was that the man chained in the shadows was a Korean Mafia boss, and freeing him would ignite a dark mafia romance that would burn her old life to the ground. At 5:47 a.m., Zalika Monroe was thinking about rent, not rescue. She had $447 to her name, a shift starting in 9 minutes, and a hero complex she couldn't afford. But when she followed those screams into the dark, she walked straight into a trap where the power dynamic was twisted. The man in chains looked dangerous. The woman standing free looked trapped. This is the story of a forbidden choice and the predator who would become her protector. If you believe that some desires are worth the risk of death, stay with me. Because once the black waitress locks eyes with the Korean Mafia boss, there is no turning back, and the debt he owes her will change everything. The screaming started at 5:47 a.m., slicing through the pre-dawn quiet like a razor. Zalika Monroe froze, one worn sneaker hovering over a puddle in the alley behind Morrison Street. She knew this shortcut by heart, a necessary evil to make the opening shift at Rosie's Diner on time. To her right, the abandoned textile warehouse loomed, a decaying skeleton of broken windows and rusted fire escapes that everyone in Los Angeles had learned to ignore. But you couldn't ignore screaming. It wasn't the usual noise of the city. It was raw, wet, and terrified. Zalika pulled an earbud out, the tinny sound of a podcast dying as she strained to listen. Nothing but the distant hum of traffic on the 10 freeway. Just keep walking, she told herself, her grip tightening on her purse strap. She was a black waitress with less than $500 to her name and a boss looking for any excuse to fire her. Being late meant losing her job, and losing her job meant eviction. The math was simple, brutal, and left no room for heroics. She took a step forward, determined to mind her own business. That's what smart people did. That's what survivors did. But then the sound came again, a muffled, desperate cry that ended in a choke, echoing up from the basement ventilation grate near her feet. It was the sound of someone who knew they were about to die. Zalika's stomach clenched. Her father had died pulling a stranger from a burning car when she was 6, a legacy of stupid bravery her mother had always warned her against. Don't be a hero, Zalika. Heroes end up dead. But her feet weren't listening. Instead of walking toward the safety of the diner and her tips, she found herself moving toward the chain-link fence that had been cut open years ago. The air around the building smelled of rot and old iron. She slipped through the gap in the fence, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This is insane, she thought, pulling her phone out and switching on the flashlight. You're going to get yourself killed over a noise. But the silence that followed the scream was worse than the sound itself. It was heavy, pregnant with violence. She reached the side entrance, a heavy metal door that hung slightly ajar, leading down into the pitch-black basement. Every instinct she had developed growing up in Englewood screamed at her to turn around.
Run.
Go to work. Forget you heard anything. But she couldn't. The pull was physical, a magnetic force dragging her into the dark. She took a breath that tasted of mildew and fear and stepped across the threshold, leaving the safety of the morning light behind. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the only witness to whatever nightmare was unfolding in the dark below. The metal stairs groaned under Zalika's weight, a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silence. She froze, heart hammering against her ribs, but the voices below continued, unbothered. She was no longer just a black waitress afraid of being late. She was a trespasser in hell. Zalika pressed herself against the cold concrete wall, peering into the dim expanse of the basement. The air was thick with the smell of rust, mildew, and something organic and rotting. Through the shadows, she saw them. Men in dark suits, their posture casual as they smoked cigarettes, guns holstered at their sides like mobile phones. They were guarding a heavy metal door set into the far wall. Zalika watched as 2 of the men stubbed out their cigarettes and ascended the stairs she had just come down, their laughter trailing behind them. That left 2, one pacing, one standing guard. It was now or never. Driven by a pulse of adrenaline that drowned out her common sense, She waited for the pacing guard to turn his back. In that split second of opportunity, she moved. She didn't run. She flowed through the debris, slipping through the shadows until she reached the heavy iron door. It wasn't locked, just latched. With a prayer to a god she hadn't spoken to in years, she threw the bolt and slipped inside, closing the world out behind her. The room was a suffocating box of concrete, but Zalika didn't notice the walls. She noticed the man. Beck Jeanrock was chained to the far wall, his arms suspended by heavy industrial links that forced him to his knees. His shirt was shredded, soaked in dark, drying blood, and his face was a ruin of violence, his left eye swollen shut, his lips split. By all rights, the Korean Mafia Boss should have looked broken. He should have been a victim waiting for a savior. But when his head lifted and his one good eye locked onto hers, the air in the room shifted instantly. There was no fear in his gaze. No gratitude. Instead, a terrifying, unnatural calm radiated from him. Even on his knees, battered and bleeding, he didn't look like a prisoner. He looked like a king sitting on a throne of wreckage, patiently waiting for his subjects to return. The cognitive dissonance hit Zalika like a physical blow. She was the one standing free, yet under his steady stare, she felt trapped. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a ruined rasp that still carried the weight of a command. Zalika took a step back, her hands trembling. She had come to rescue a helpless man from the dark. But staring at the lethal intelligence burning in Beck Jeanrock's eye, she realized with a jolt of pure dread that she hadn't found a victim. She had found a predator, and she had just walked into his cage. "I'm Zalika," she whispered, the name feeling small in the heavy air of the basement. "And we're leaving." "You're insane," Beck Jeanrock rasped, his gaze shifting to the door as it shook under a heavy blow from the outside. "They'll kill you." "Probably," Zalika shot back, fear lending a sharp edge to her voice. She scanned the room frantically until her eyes landed on a rusted piece of rebar in the corner, forgotten construction debris, just like the Korean Mafia Boss was supposed to be. She grabbed it, the metal cold and biting against her palm, and jammed it behind the bolt anchoring his left shackle to the wall. "Hold still," she ordered, leveraging her entire body weight against the bar. Jeanrock didn't argue. Despite his injuries, he moved with a fluid, predatory efficiency, using his free hand to brace the bolt as she heaved. The concrete groaned, cracking under the pressure. Outside, the shouting had stopped, a silence that was infinitely worse than the noise. It meant the guards were no longer trying to break in, they were planning. "They're getting ready to breach," Jeanrock said, his voice flat. "When they do, aim for the eyes. Don't hesitate." Zalika didn't have time to process the violence of his advice. With a final, desperate shove, the bolt tore free from the wall with a screech of metal that set her teeth on edge. Jeanrock slumped forward, the heavy chain still dangling from his wrist, but he was free of the wall. "My legs," he hissed through gritted teeth as he tried to stand and stumbled. "Numb." Zalika caught him, his weight nearly crushing her. He was solid muscle, dense and unyielding. "Then I'll be your legs," she grunted, hauling him toward the door. But before they could take a step, the sound of a key turning in the lock froze them. They were too late. The guards were back. Zalika's mind raced, adrenaline flooding her system. She couldn't fight armed men, but she could make them look the wrong way. She spotted a chunk of broken concrete near her foot. Without a second thought, she grabbed it and hurled it into the far darkness of the room. Clang! The noise echoed like a gunshot. The door swung open, and two silhouettes burst in, guns drawn, their attention snapping instantly toward the sound in the shadows. "Move," Zalika breathed. They didn't run, they scrambled. Staying low, Zalika dragged the Korean Mafia Boss through the blind spot of the doorway just as the guards opened fire on the empty darkness. They spilled out into the corridor, the deafening roar of gunshots ringing in their ears. They were out of the cage, but now the hunt was on. The transition from the suffocating darkness of the basement to the gray light of the Los Angeles dawn was blinding. Zalika shoved Beck Jeanrock through the ground floor window she'd entered only 20 minutes ago, the two of them collapsing onto the concrete courtyard in a tangle of limbs and gasping breath. "Move," Gene Rock rasped, his voice tight with pain but still commanding. 2 blocks east. Black Audi. License plate 4KL. He rattled off the numbers with machine-like precision, his mind clearly operating on a level that pain couldn't touch. Zalika hauled him up. He was dead weight now, the adrenaline fading enough for the agony of his injuries to register. She wrapped his arm around her shoulders, gritting her teeth as they stumbled into the back alley. Behind them, the wail of sirens cut the air. The police were at the front entrance. If they stayed, she wouldn't be a witness. She'd be an accomplice. "Keys," she panted, dragging him toward the street. "Do you have them?" "Spare," he grunted, wincing as his feet dragged. "Taped to my chest." Zalika froze for a microsecond. "You tape car keys to your body?" "Trust issues," he muttered, a grimace twisting his bloodied face. They reached the black sedan, its sleek frame looking alien amidst the grime of the alley. Zalika's hands shook as she fumbled with his torn shirt, her fingers brushing against the warm, damp skin of the Korean Mafia Boss to find the small magnetic box taped to his ribs. The intimacy of the action, touching the bare skin of a dangerous stranger, sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with fear. She ripped the key free, unlocked the car, and shoved him into the passenger seat before scrambling behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, a low, powerful growl that vibrated through her bones. As she peeled away from the curb, merging into the early morning traffic of downtown, the reality of what she had just done crashed down on her. She looked at the rearview mirror. The warehouse was shrinking, swallowed by the distance. Beside her, Gene Rock had slumped against the window, unconscious, the heavy chains still locked around his wrists. "What have I done?" she whispered, her grip on the steering wheel white-knuckled. She had started the morning as a black waitress worried about a $1,400 rent payment. Now, she was driving a getaway car for a crime lord, harboring a fugitive, and fleeing a crime scene. The bridge back to her old life wasn't just burned, it was incinerated. She pressed the gas pedal harder, driving deeper into the city, knowing with terrifying clarity that she had just crossed a line from which there was no return. Zalika's studio apartment in Englewood was a fortress of solitude, a third-floor walk-up filled with second-hand furniture and the scent of lemon polish. It was a world away from the industrial hell of the basement, but as she dragged the semi-conscious Korean Mafia Boss through her front door, those two worlds collided violently. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chun, had opened her door just as they stumbled up the landing. The older woman took one look at the black waitress supporting a bloodied man in chains, her eyes lingering on the metal shackles, before simply nodding and retreating inside. In this building, survival meant minding your own business. Zalika lowered Gene Rock onto her beige IKEA couch, the fabric instantly absorbing the dark stain of his blood. The apartment, usually her sanctuary, suddenly felt claustrophobic. Gene Rock, even broken and bleeding, consumed the space. He was too large, too dangerous, and too undeniably present for her small life. "First aid kit," she muttered, forcing her hands to stop shaking as she retrieved the plastic box from under the sink. She knelt between his legs, the forced proximity making the air thick and heavy. She had to cut the remains of his shirt away to see the damage. As the fabric fell, revealing a torso mapped with fresh bruises and old scars, the reality of the dark mafia romance she had stumbled into began to take shape, not in words, but in the heat radiating from his skin. "Who were those men?" she asked, her voice trembling as she pressed an antiseptic pad to a jagged cut on his ribs. Gene Rock hissed in pain, his eyes fluttering open to lock onto hers. The lethality was dampening, replaced by a haze of exhaustion. "The Choi organization," he whispered. "Rivals." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "I run the Kim family. We're the Korean Mafia, and I'm the head of operations in Los Angeles." The confession hung in the air, a death sentence spoken aloud. He waited for her to run, to scream, to call the police. Instead, Zalika dipped a cloth in water and gently wiped the blood from his jaw. Well, Mr. Mafia Boss, she said, her voice finding a steel she didn't know she possessed. You're human enough to bleed, so sit still and let me patch you up. Gene Rock didn't look away. For the first time, a flicker of something other than calculation crossed his face, a confused, reluctant fascination. You really are insane, he murmured, but he leaned into her touch. In the silence of the apartment, with the smell of copper and rubbing alcohol filling her nose, Zalika realized with a jolt of terror that she didn't want to pull away. The spark had been struck, and now they were both waiting for the fire. The vibration of the phone against the cheap laminate counter sounded like a drill. Zalika stared at the screen, the name, Rosie's Diner, flashing like a warning light. She answered, already knowing her life as a struggling black waitress was about to end. Where the hell are you? Rosie's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Your shift started an hour ago. You know how many times I've covered for you, Zoe? I know, Zalika said, her voice hollow. She looked across the small studio at the man bleeding on her couch. I had an emergency. Don't care. This is the third time this month. You're done. Come pick up your last check whenever. The line went dead. Zalika lowered the phone, a strange numbness spreading through her chest. In 5 days, rent was due. She would be evicted, homeless, destroyed. All because she had heard a scream in a basement and refused to walk away. She had traded her survival for his. I heard, Gene Rock said quietly. He was sitting up now, the movement clearly agonizing, but his gaze was lucid. You lost your job. Thin walls, Zalika muttered, tossing the phone onto the cushion. I'll pay you, he said, the Korean Mafia boss emerging through the pain, trying to solve a problem with resources she couldn't fathom. Whatever you were making, I'll triple it. Compensation for what you've lost. I don't want your money, she snapped, defensive anger flaring. I didn't do this for a payout. I'm not some charity case you need to manage. Gene Rock studied her, his eyes narrowing, and then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It transformed his battered face. You're proud. I respect that. But pride doesn't pay rent. He shifted, wincing as his broken ribs protested. The levity vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a dark, brooding intensity. I need to make calls. I can't stay here. The Choi knew where I'd be. They knew when I'd be alone. How? Zalika asked, stepping closer. Someone in my organization sold me out, he rasped, a dangerous light igniting in his eyes. My own family. When I find out who, they'll wish the Choi had gotten to them first. The revelation chilled the room. He wasn't just hiding from enemies, he was being hunted by his own blood. Zalika realized then that there was no safe place for him, and by extension, no safe place for her. She was no longer just an unemployed waitress. She was collateral damage in a war she didn't understand. So what happens now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gene Rock looked at her, his expression unreadable. Now, we survive long enough to make them regret they missed. The knock on the door was precise, a rhythmic signal that made Gene Rock's shoulders drop in relief, while Zalika's heart hammered a frantic warning. This was the moment the black waitress lost control of her sanctuary. Gene Rock opened the door to reveal 2 men. The first, older with silver-streaked hair, swept the room with eyes that missed nothing, the blood-stained couch, the makeshift bandages, and Zalika standing defensively by the window. The second man, carrying a medical bag, moved immediately to the Korean Mafia boss, treating him with a reverence that made Zalika's stomach turn. Zalika, Gene Rock said, switching to English. This is De-young, my second-in-command. They're here to help. De-young turned to her. You are the one who saved him. You have done the Kim family a great service. I didn't do it for your family, Zalika said, her voice shaking but defiant. I did it because he was screaming in a basement. And now I want you all to leave. I want my life back. I'm afraid that's not possible, De-young replied, his tone polite but absolute. The moment you touched him, you became part of this war. The Choi will be looking for whoever rescued him. If they find you, they will hurt you just to send a message. So, I just abandoned my life? Zalika stared at Gene Rock, pleading for him to be the man she'd bonded with, not the monster. I lose everything because I helped you? Yes, Gene Rock said. No apology. Just the brutal truth of his world. Pack a bag. You're coming with us. He moved toward her, wincing, his intensity burning through the pain. I won't let them touch you. You are under my protection now. But you have to come willingly. Zalika looked at the men filling her tiny apartment, at the guns bulging under their jackets, and realized she had no choice. She was no longer a civilian. She was a mafia asset. 1 week, she negotiated, her voice trembling. I give you 1 week to fix this. Then I walk away. Agreed, Gene Rock said. The extraction was a blur of black SUVs and tinted windows, whisking her away from Englewood to a world she had only seen in movies. They brought her to a high-rise in Wilshire, a building with doormen and silent elevators. The apartment was a sprawling expanse of hardwood and glass, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city. Make yourself comfortable, De Jong said, pausing at the door. There are guards outside. Do not leave. So I'm a prisoner, Zalika said, staring at the expensive furniture that felt colder than her second-hand couch. You're a guest, De Jong corrected. An honored one. But yes, for your safety, you cannot leave. The door clicked shut, locking her in. Zalika walked to the window, looking down at the city that suddenly felt like a chessboard she didn't know how to play. She was safe, surrounded by luxury, but as she pressed her hand against the glass, she knew the truth. She had traded the cage of poverty for a gilded cage built by the Korean Mafia Boss, and the key was in his pocket. The silence in the Wilshire penthouse was heavier than the chains in the basement. Zalika Monroe paced the hardwood floors, the sprawling city lights of Los Angeles below mocking her. She was a black waitress trapped in a glass tower, surrounded by luxury she couldn't touch and protected by men she couldn't trust. Her phone buzzed against the marble countertop, an unknown number. She hesitated, her heart jumping into her throat, then answered. Zalika. The voice was faint, stripped of the lethal command that usually defined the Korean Mafia Boss, but the intensity remained. Gene Rock. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. Where are you? Prepping for surgery, he rasped. The background noise of medical machines beeped a steady, frantic rhythm. The lung puncture, it's complicated. I might not wake up. Don't say that, Zalika snapped, a sudden, irrational fear spiking through her chest. You survived the torture. You survived the escape. You don't get to die on an operating table now. I need you to know something, he interrupted, his breath hitching as the drugs began to pull him under. In my world, everyone has an angle. Everyone wants power, money, or leverage. But you risked everything for a stranger in the dark. You helped me without wanting a thing in return. The confession hung between them, raw and terrifyingly intimate. It stripped away the titles of criminal and civilian, leaving only two people connected by a thread of violence. I just did what I had to do, she whispered, her voice trembling. No, he corrected, his voice fading but heavy with conviction. You were brave when you should have run. If I survive this, Zalika, I swear to you, I will repay this debt. I will give you back your life, but better, safer. You will never have to be invisible again. Just survive, you stubborn man. We can talk about debts later. A weak, breathy laugh echoed down the line, softer than she had ever heard him. Stubborn. Yes. I'll survive for you. The line went dead. Zalika lowered the phone, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. She should have felt relief that he might die. It would free her from this dangerous web, from the Choi, from the guns outside her door. But instead, she felt a hollow, aching panic. She realized with a jolt that she didn't want the Korean Mafia Boss to die. She wanted him to keep his promise. She wanted to see him again, not as a victim in a basement, but as the man who had looked at her with hope in his eyes. When the rest of the world saw only a monster, the sun had long since set over Los Angeles, turning the city into a grid of glittering indifference. Inside the penthouse, the waiting felt like a physical weight. Zalika sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. She was a black waitress suspended in a gilded cage, terrified that the man who held the key had died on an operating table. At 11:47 p.m., the phone finally rang. He made it. De Jong's voice came through, clipped and professional, but with an undercurrent of exhaustion. The surgery was successful. The lung is repaired. He will live. Relief crashed into Zalika so hard she nearly dropped the phone. She slumped back against the cushions, letting out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since she first stepped into that basement. "Thank God," she whispered. "Miss Monroe," De Jong continued, his tone shifting. "I heard your voice just now. That wasn't relief for a stranger. That was relief for someone you care about." Zalika opened her mouth to deny it, to say it was just adrenaline or guilt, but the lie died on her tongue. "Is that a crime in your world?" she asked softly. "It makes you dangerous," De Jong warned. "Because if he cares about you, and he does, his enemies will use that. Hope is a liability." The line went dead, leaving Zalika alone with the terrifying truth. She cared. She cared about the Korean Mafia boss who had upended her life. Minutes later, her phone buzzed again. A text. "Awake. Hurts like hell, but alive because of you. Thank you, Zalika. HJ." She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering. She should be professional. She should be distant. Instead, she typed, "You scared me. Don't do that again. Rest. We'll talk when you're stronger." The response was immediate, as if he had been waiting for her. "We'll do more than talk. When I'm healed, I'm taking you to dinner. Somewhere nice, where you can yell at me properly for ruining your life." Zalika smiled, a tear finally escaping to track down her cheek. "You can barely stand, and you're already planning dates. You really are stubborn." "Too stubborn to die," he replied. "Too stubborn to let you walk away without showing you what your bravery earned." Zalika set the phone down, her heart pounding a rhythm that felt like a war drum. The boring life she had fought so hard to keep was gone, incinerated the moment she chose to pry those chains from the wall. She had saved a monster, and in return, he had given her something she hadn't expected, a reason to be alive. The black waitress and the crime lord were no longer just strangers brought together by a scream in the dark. They were partners in a dangerous game, and as she looked out at the city lights, Zalika knew she was ready to play. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt something was wrong, but the experts told you everything was fine? Let us know your story below. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next thrilling chapter. See you in the next video.